She shot her. She's the one who shot her. She's the one who shot her. Restraining order, but she shot her. The gun's in the car.
I'm licensed to carry.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, bitch.
You shot somebody, nigga. Go put the gun in the car.
Hey,
She put the gun in the car. The gun is in the car. Arrest her.
This is Cold Case Chronicles True Crime, where every silence hides a secret, and every story deserves to be heard. We uncover the mysteries buried in time, the victims, the motives, the truths long forgotten. Subscribe now and join us as we dive into the world's darkest cases, because every smile hides a story, and every mystery deserves a voice.
The day before the encounter that would come to define headlines and court filings was not unlike any other. The sun rose over the city, pale against the horizon, and the rhythms of life began again. Buses on their routes, pedestrians walking familiar blocks, the cadence of ordinary errands and obligations. In moments like these, violence feels distant, a story that happens somewhere else, to someone unknown. But the ordinary moments are where life's fragile continuity is lived, breath by breath, choice by choice, gesture by gesture. We begin not with the shooting itself, that moment already documented in legal filings and news reports, but with an event that in footage and witness description became a flashpoint, a fist bump. A gesture so familiar, so commonplace, that its weight is not in its novelty, but in its normalcy. In homes, sports arenas, workplaces, schoolyards, the fist bump is a signal of greeting, of camaraderie, of shared understanding. It is a movement that carries no threat by itself. In this case, it would later be cited again and again in court as a detail, not because it explains what happened, but because it forces us to sit with how a gesture of shared contact became part of a narrative marked by loss. To situate ourselves in the truth of what occurred, we have to resist the temptation to turn that gesture into metaphor prematurely. The fist bump did not cause the violence. It did not explain it, but its presence, recorded in witness testimony, reminds us that tragedy rarely arrives fully formed. It grows in the spaces between familiarity and rupture, in the shared moments that suddenly make no sense. The victim, Romeca Blackmon, was 31 years old, a mother, a presence in her community, a life woven into routine, relationship, and responsibility. On September 8, 2025, after stepping out of a vehicle in the South Loop of Chicago, a neighborhood defined by its mix of residential life and city energy, she was shot and killed. At the time, her son was not with her. She was focused, as she had been every day, on living a life defined by ordinary commitments and connections. In the days that followed, news outlets reported the basic facts: the shooting, the identification of Romeca Blackmon, the police investigation, the subsequent charging of Quadajah Johnson with first-degree murder and other counts. Headlines spoke of violence, of legal proceedings, of the fatal encounter. But headlines, by their very nature, are compact. They cannot contain texture. They cannot contain interiority. They cannot contain the subtle architecture of a life or the slow fracture of human relationship. Quadajah Johnson appeared in court in 2026 as her trial approached. A judge denied her request for release based on the severity of the charges and the state's argument for risk. Prosecutors alleged that the shooting occurred after a confrontation, that there was physical interaction, and that the act of violence which ended Blackmon's life was not accidental. Defense advocates and family members, including the father of both women's children, challenged elements of that claim, particularly the assertion about physical contact before the shooting. They argued that parts of the narrative were being shaped by assumptions, not evidence. What we are left with, in public records, in court filings, in witness reports, is a story marked by contradiction and uncertainty. Where one witness sees threat, another sees misunderstanding. Where one side sees intention, another sees confusion. The trial itself becomes a space where meaning is negotiated, contested, and weighed against the hard criteria of law. In trying to understand what happened, we must examine more than the event. We must consider the psychological landscape that preceded it, the interplay of emotion, expectation, avoidance, and response. We must examine behavior in context. We must observe the way two lives, distinct, complex, and fully human, intersected on a day that would leave one family in mourning and an entire community searching for understanding. In public forums, people often ask, "Why did this happen?" That question assumes that there is a singular answer, that beneath the surface there is a cause as neat as a headline. But human behavior is rarely so tidy. Motive is not a single point, it is an accumulation of patterns, choices, silences, and pressures that eventually converge. Consider how we greet one another. A handshake, a hug, a wave, a fist bump, each carries layers of meaning shaped by context, relationship, and social norms. A gesture that is friendly in one moment may feel cold or distant in another, depending on tone, body language, and environment. Consider how easily misunderstanding can arise where intention is not fully articulated and where the inner experience of one person is invisible to another. In the weeks before that September day, those who knew both women described moments of tension, not explosive, not dramatic, but noticeable in their subtlety. Missed texts, delayed responses, invitations made and unfulfilled. These are not the moments that make news. They are not the moments that appear in police reports, but they are part of the texture of life, the quiet architecture of human interaction. When we look back with full knowledge of the outcome, it is tempting to see in these small moments the inevitable trajectory toward tragedy. But understanding is not the same as inevitability. The difference matters. Because narrative justice, the kind that shapes public perception, often seeks a beginning, a middle, and an end. Life rarely offers such clean divisions. In preparing for the courtroom proceedings, investigators reconstructed timelines, interviewed witnesses, and examined physical evidence. They charted the movements of both women in the hours before the shooting. They attempted to recreate the environment. Who was present? What was said? What was done? They mapped the geography of the scene, the locations where each person stood, the positioning of vehicles, the places where bystanders reported seeing movement. Yet even with this technical rigor, there remain gaps. There are unanswered questions. There are contradictions in testimony. There are moments when one account diverges from another, not in wild fashion, but in the quiet ways that reflect difference in perception. One witness might attest to seeing a fist bump exchanged. Another might describe the same moment as a gesture of acknowledgement, nothing more. Still another might not recall the moment at all. What does it mean that the same instant can be experienced so differently? It means that human perception is not objective. It means that the courtroom, no matter how thorough, is still a space where meaning is contested. The legal process is designed to weigh evidence, to assess credibility, to sift through competing narratives, but it cannot, by its nature, reconstruct interior experience. It cannot read intention. It cannot access the emotional states that shaped a decision in the seconds before a life was lost. It can only infer, interpret, compare, and argue. And so we return to the human elements that define every story like this: connection and withdrawal, expectation and disappointment, presence and absence. These are the forces that shape behavior long before a single word is spoken in a courtroom. To understand the lives intertwined in this tragedy, we look to patterns rather than fireworks. We observe not outbursts, but the soft closures of conversation. We note not anger erupting, but interest receding. We see not dramatic confrontation, but an accumulation of nuanced interactions that, over time, alter the emotional field between two people. As the trial unfolds, the courtroom becomes not just a stage for adjudication, but a lens through which we examine the complexity of human motive. Legal arguments focus on evidence, chronology, consistency. But beneath them lies a more subtle question. How do ordinary gestures, a text message, a handshake, a fist bump, become charged with meaning in the context of emotional vulnerability? Those questions will not be answered neatly. They cannot be. What we can do, what we must do, is hold the complexity. We must resist the simplification that comes easily in headlines. We must acknowledge the layers of interior experience that define every human life. And as we continue, we will follow the investigation, the courtroom testimony, the expert analysis, and the emotional aftermath that has rippled through two families and a community. We will walk through the scene of the shooting, not for spectacle, but for context. We will listen to witness accounts, not for drama, but for texture. We will examine motive not as a single point, but as a pattern. Because in stories like this, truth is not contained in a single gesture. It emerges from the interplay of behavior, context, relationship, and consequence. The scene outside the South Loop building on that September day was ordinary in appearance. Sidewalks busy with pedestrian traffic, the hum of vehicles passing, streetlights glinting off wet pavement from a morning drizzle. But ordinary surfaces can hide extraordinary rupture. It is in such spaces, a step forward, a gesture exchanged, a glance met, that human lives pivot without warning. Witnesses would later describe the moments leading to the shooting with striking similarity. A casual approach, words spoken in a tone that seemed neutral, and then the gesture, the fist bump, that would later occupy so much attention. It was not recorded on video, nor fully captured in police reports beyond mentions in testimony. And yet the gesture itself became a point of focus, a symbol of human behavior collapsing into tragedy. A friendly motion transformed into a pivot upon which a life ended. To those who observed from a distance, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. A casual gesture, a short exchange. But perception, as always, is limited. Context is everything. The alignment of timing, location, and emotional state created conditions no one could have anticipated. Investigators quickly sought to reconstruct not only the physical events, but also the subtle interactions preceding them. Phone records, text exchanges, and social media activity were examined to understand the interpersonal context. Friends and acquaintances recounted shifts in tone, small withdrawals in behavior, and conversations that revealed mounting tension. These were not explosive arguments. They were silences that carried weight, pauses that became pressure, withdrawals that went unnoticed at the time, but in hindsight formed a pattern. The courtroom in 2026 became the space where these patterns were articulated aloud. Prosecutors meticulously detailed timelines, the interactions, the alleged confrontation, and Johnson's behavior immediately afterward. They argued that the deadly outcome was the culmination of choices, not a momentary loss of control, but a series of interactions that created conditions for violence. Defense attorneys countered, emphasizing ambiguity, context, and alternative interpretations of witness statements. Throughout, the figure of the victim remained central. Her presence, her humanity, her agency. Romeca Blackmon was described repeatedly by those who knew her as careful, deliberate, and attentive. A mother who prioritized her child, a friend who managed multiple commitments, a community member who engaged quietly but meaningfully. Her life was ordinary in form but layered in depth, the kind of life that becomes impossible to fully reconstruct once abruptly ended. In reviewing the interactions leading to the shooting, it is essential to understand behavioral subtleties. Gestures, words, and expressions carry meaning beyond the literal. A delayed response can signal disengagement. A smile can mask hesitation. Small physical movements, a turn of the head, a step back, can indicate unspoken boundaries. Humans are constantly interpreting one another through these subtle signals, often unaware of the emotional weight they carry. This is the lens through which we view the fist bump moment, not as a single cause of tragedy, but as an emblem of human connection and miscommunication. It highlights how familiar behaviors, under the wrong circumstances, can coincide with catastrophic outcomes. Ordinary gestures are not inherently dangerous, but in the complex interplay of relationships, emotional states, and context, ordinary gestures can become part of a sequence that ends tragically. Witnesses recounted varying perceptions of the scene. Some emphasized that nothing about the exchange seemed threatening. Others noted tension in body language, minor cues that indicated stress or caution. Law enforcement recognized the difficulty inherent in reconstructing such moments. Perceptions differ, memories fade, and trauma distorts clarity. Even within minutes of an event, human recollection is filtered, fragmented, and incomplete. Expert testimony at trial focused on these human factors, how stress, prior experiences, and social dynamics influence behavior. Psychologists explain that microsignals, subtle cues like hesitation, posture, or facial expressions, affect perception and decision-making in real time. While these explanations cannot justify violence, they illuminate the psychological environment in which tragedy occurs. The trial revealed additional complexities in the relationship between Johnson and Blackmon. There were shared acquaintances, overlapping social circles, and history that extended beyond casual acquaintance. Prosecutors highlighted prior verbal conflicts, subtle tensions, and behavioral patterns that suggested an ongoing interpersonal dynamic. Defense attorneys emphasized that these interactions were open to interpretation, not inherently predictive of lethal outcome. Courtroom discussions also examined immediate reactions. Johnson's conduct after the incident, statements to law enforcement, and actions of bystanders were scrutinized for intent, situational awareness, and emotional state. Each account was cross-examined, inconsistencies highlighted, and motives debated. These legal processes, though procedural and structured, offered a window into human behavior under extreme circumstances. Even as testimony unfolded, media coverage focused heavily on the sensational aspects, the fist bump, the public confrontation, the tragic outcome. Yet the more meaningful story lies beneath these headlines, in the human behavior, in the accumulation of small choices, in the intersection of ordinary gestures and extraordinary consequence. Romeca Blackmon's life, her daily routines, and her quiet attentiveness to her son provide the emotional anchor of this narrative. Each moment of care, each note, each conversation she engaged in before the fatal encounter underscores the fragility of ordinary life when intersected by violence. Her agency, her decisions, and her presence are what allow us to reconstruct not just what happened, but what was lost. In exploring the case, it becomes evident that understanding is not achieved through drama alone. It is achieved through careful observation, analysis of behavior patterns, and recognition of the quiet complexities that shape human interactions. Violence does not emerge in isolation. It emerges in context, and context is built over time, in the rhythms of daily life, in repeated interactions, in gestures that seem mundane but carry accumulated significance. The 2026 courtroom proceedings further illuminated these themes. Witnesses testified, evidence was reviewed, and the narrative of the event was painstakingly reconstructed. The defense and prosecution presented interpretations of intent, perception, and consequence. Both sides sought to influence the understanding of human behavior, but the court's role was not to resolve psychology, it was to adjudicate based on law and evidence. As observers, we can examine the same material for insight into human experience. We can study how ordinary gestures, unremarkable interactions, and subtle behavioral patterns converge to create conditions in which tragedy becomes possible. We can explore the emotional landscapes of both victim and accused, and we can reflect on the ways in which silence, withdrawal, and miscommunication contribute to outcomes that appear sudden, but are in fact the product of cumulative human experience. Inside the courtroom, the ritual of procedure took on a quiet weight. The judge entered, robes falling into place, a subtle signal that order would govern the space. Attorneys approached tables, folders in hand, faces measured, calm. The spectators, seated along the benches, maintained an almost ritualistic silence, phones tucked away, eyes forward, minds already processing the narrative being constructed, but unable to grasp its full human weight. Witnesses were called. One by one, their accounts unfolded in controlled cadence. Some described the moment of the shooting itself, where Romeca stood, how she moved, the gestures she made. Others recounted what led up to that day. Conversations that were clipped, missed texts, tension in tone or body language, interactions that seemed mundane at the time, but would later be reinterpreted under the gravity of hindsight. The fist bump, repeated in questioning and testimony, became a focal point, not for its novelty, but for its symbolic weight. A casual gesture turned narrative pivot. To one witness, it was friendly. To another, it was acknowledgement. To the state, it became a behavioral marker in the chain of events preceding the shooting. It is here in the courtroom's meticulous reconstruction that the subtlety of human interaction is most visible. How ordinary actions can, in combination, carry extraordinary consequences. Psychologists and experts testified on human perception under stress. They spoke not in sensational terms, but clinically, of micro-expressions, of hesitation, of the cues we read into gestures. One expert described how decision-making can compress under pressure, how prior experiences shape interpretation of ordinary actions, and how misaligned perception between two people can produce outcomes neither intended. The courtroom was a space where behavior was parsed, interpreted, and measured against legal standards. But it was also a space where the fragility of understanding human intention was laid bare. Family members of both women were present, restrained in demeanor, absorbing the weight of each statement. Their expressions fluctuated subtly, a tightening of the jaw, a slight nod, eyes shifting, small, human indicators of grief, anxiety, and hope. They were witnesses not just to proceedings, but to the public unfolding of a private tragedy. Testimony often returned to behavioral patterns. Friends and acquaintances described Johnson as quiet, deliberate, and unremarkable in ordinary settings. Withdrawal and silence, rather than volatility, characterized many interactions. They spoke of her measured manner, her tendency to disengage rather than confront, her preference for routine. Yet these very traits were discussed in court as part of a larger picture, how patterns of avoidance, coupled with escalating tension, intersected with the events that day. Romeca Blackmon's presence in the narrative remained vivid through personal recollections. Teachers, co-workers, friends, each recounted her attentiveness, her care, her capacity to manage multiple responsibilities while maintaining warmth and engagement. Each testimony painted a portrait of ordinary life, punctuated by intention and thoughtfulness, interrupted abruptly by violence. The prosecution highlighted sequences of interaction, moments of conversation, gestures, and movement leading to the shooting. They argued that these were not isolated events, but a trajectory of escalating interpersonal tension. Each witness, each piece of evidence, each reconstructed step contributed to a narrative that emphasized context, accumulation, and consequence. Defense counsel, conversely, emphasized ambiguity, intent, and interpretation. They argued that gestures are inherently neutral, that interactions are subject to differing perception, and that the chain of events cannot be reduced to a single causal action. They reminded the court that ordinary behavior, even when intersected with conflict, does not inherently predict catastrophic outcome. Observers of the trial often noted its tension, not in spectacle, but in precision. Every statement, every cross-examination, every evidentiary review became a window into human decision-making, into the subtleties of behavior, into the psychological environment that surrounds conflict. The courtroom was both stage and lens, a place where law meets human psychology, where narrative is reconstructed, and where meaning is contested. Outside the courtroom, the community responded in measured ways. Local news outlets reported on proceedings, focusing on legal milestones and dramatic elements such as the fist bump. Social media commentary often reduced complex human interaction to sound bites or memes. But within the controlled environment of the trial, those same moments were unpacked with methodical care. The contrast between public perception and courtroom reality highlighted a persistent tension. What is visible versus what is understood? What is sensational versus what is substantive? And in the midst of all this, the human consequences remained clear. Romeca's absence was constant in conversations, in testimony, in silence between speakers. Her life, ordinary in form, extraordinary in its relational depth, was invoked repeatedly as the anchor around which evidence, testimony, and legal arguments rotated. Her absence was not just the absence of presence, but the absence of ongoing potential. Moments never lived, interactions never realized, gestures never returned. The trial also underscored the subtlety of human intent. Johnson's behavior before and after the incident became subject to careful analysis. The same gestures that had been casual and neutral in ordinary life were reframed through the lens of legal scrutiny. Each movement, each expression, each pause carried weight. The legal system does not interpret behavior for its emotional texture, but for its relevance to evidence and law. Yet the layers of psychology, withdrawal, avoidance, perception, remain inseparable from the human narrative. To understand this case fully, one must hold these complexities simultaneously. Gesture and consequence, ordinary behavior and extraordinary outcome, silence and perception, human fallibility and legal accountability. The story is not a simple chronology. It is a web of relational dynamics, contextual nuance, and psychological subtlety. The courtroom's conclusion, when it arrives, will adjudicate based on law. But the human lesson is broader. Ordinary gestures, unremarkable interactions, and subtle behavioral cues can intersect with context and tension to create outcomes no one intends. The tragedy is not born of dramatic flair, but of accumulation, of the quiet pressures that shape human interaction over time. The courtroom eventually fell silent. The judge delivered instructions, and the verdict, whatever it might be, would arrive not with fanfare, but with measured authority. In that stillness, one could feel the weight of every interaction that had led to this day. The small gestures, the silences, the withdrawals, the conversations that had never resolved themselves. For Romeca Blackmon, the outcome of the trial could not restore what was lost. Her son would grow up with the memory of absence, of a mother's love expressed in notes, smiles, and care that were abruptly curtailed. Friends and family carry grief quietly, in gestures, in pauses, in the deliberate care of continued life. The human cost, unquantifiable, remained. For Quadajah Johnson, the trial examined behavior, context, and consequence. The court weighed evidence, testimony, and interpretation. Yet even within its structure, the nuances of interior experience, what she felt, why she acted, could only ever be partially understood. Human intent, complex and layered, exists both within and beyond the reach of law. As observers, we are left with questions rather than neat answers. We can analyze, reconstruct, and interpret, but we cannot undo what occurred. We can see the accumulation of ordinary human behaviors, the gestures, the withdrawals, the moments of tension, and understand how they converged in ways that produced tragedy. Some gestures, some silences, some omissions carry weight far beyond their apparent significance. The fist bump that became central to this story is not inherently dangerous. It is ordinary, familiar, human. Yet in this context, it intersects with tension, misunderstanding, and human fragility to become a symbol of how life can pivot in a moment. And so the story closes not with spectacle, but with reflection. We honor Romeca Blackmon not by reliving the violence, but by acknowledging her presence, her choices, her care, and her life, ordinary yet profound. We examine Quadajah Johnson's actions, not to sensationalize, but to understand the interplay of behavior, context, and consequence. We remember that tragedy is often the result of accumulation, not explosion. Silence, not noise. Misalignment, not intent alone. In the quiet after the verdict, we return to the human lesson. Ordinary interactions are fragile. Human behavior is subtle. And the consequences of our choices, small or large, ripple outward in ways impossible to predict. The lives affected, the grief endured, and the questions left unanswered are the echoes that remain. If you are watching this, take a moment to reflect on the ordinary gestures in your own life. Notice presence, notice absence, value connection, and remember that in a world of nuance, care and attention are never trivial. We welcome you to the channel. We look for the truth in the shadows of cold cases and closed files. If you value this kind of deep dive investigation, please consider subscribing. And as we end this journey, we'd love to know where you're watching from today. Whether you're joining us from the United States, Canada, Australia, or anywhere else in the world, leave a comment below. It helps us remember that these stories, though local, touch hearts across the globe. Thank you for taking this time to witness, to reflect, and to honor lives lost. Remember that even gestures as simple as a note in a lunchbox or a fist bump exchanged can carry meaning far beyond what we imagine. In their quiet, human weight, they remind us of the fragility, the depth, and the value of connection.